The smoke hit him first, a smell he knew better than his own name, the smell of things ending. Thomas Nez stood on the ridge overlooking Red Hollow, the moon painting the desert in shades of bone and blue. His horse, an old Appaloosa named S, stood quiet beside him, a ghost in the pale light. Down below, the town's only schoolhouse was being eaten alive by fire. The flames danced like devils, licking the sky, turning wood to ash and memory to smoke. He could hear the chaos, even from this distance, the shouting. A woman's scream that tore through the night. The sharp, angry pop of dry timber giving up, and above it all, one voice, clear and cold as a gunshot. Deputy Kent. "Keep those kids locked in the Miller barn. Nobody in, nobody out." Thomas's jaw tightened. The Miller barn. That wasn't a shelter. It was a tinderbox, a death trap he'd helped raise the walls on a lifetime ago. He knew every loose board, every rusty nail. He hadn't set foot in Red Hollow for months, maybe years. His world had shrunk to the size of his land, his horse, and the crushing weight of silence. The world had taken everything from him in a fire just like this one, 4 years back. It had taken his son, Nietzsche, and when they buried the boy, Thomas had buried himself right alongside him. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, that buried part of him started to dig its way out. Something deep in his chest cracked open. He swung himself onto S's back without a thought, the reins slack in his hand. The old horse moved like a whisper down the backside of the hill, a trail no one else used anymore. He didn't need a lamp. He knew every rock, every twist, every shadow. He was a shadow. At the edge of the cottonwoods behind the Miller place, he slid off the horse and crept forward. The air was thick with hate. Torchlight cut jagged holes in the darkness, throwing wild shadows against the trees. The whole town was there, a ring of angry faces circling the barn like buzzards waiting for something to die. Men with rifles clutched tight, women holding torches like they were righteous weapons. He crouched behind a rotted fence post, listening to the poison they were spitting. "Said they were laughing while it burned," a man growled, spitting on the ground. "Animals. Should have never let orphans run free." Another voice, mean and thin, cut in. "Sheriff's too soft. Grady'll want to ask questions. By the time he's done, they'll be halfway to Mexico." Then Kent's voice, low and final. "They ain't going nowhere. We'll have a rope for each of them before sunup, unless someone does something stupid." Thomas's fingers dug into the dry dirt. Kids. They were going to hang kids. He should have turned away. He should have mounted his horse and ridden back to the silence he'd chosen. Let it burn. Let the whole rotten town burn itself to the ground. But he didn't see the schoolhouse anymore. He saw another fire, another night. He saw Nietzsche's face, small and trusting, looking up at him just hours before the smoke took him. His boy, his shadow, the one he never got to pull from the flames. The thought was a blade in his gut. "You're dead. You're dead." They ain't. The inside of the barn was thick with the stink of old hay and new fear. Thomas slipped through a loose slat in the back wall, a gap he'd left there himself years ago, and dropped into the deep shadows. He heard them before he saw them. A soft shuffle, a hitched breath, then a voice, small but sharp as a shard of glass. "Stay back. We have nothing left to lose." A boy, no taller than his saddle horn, stepped out from behind a stack of hay. He was holding a broken rake like a spear, his knuckles white. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were on fire. Behind him, 5 other faces peeked out from the darkness, dirty, tear-streaked, but watching him with the desperate attention of cornered animals. Thomas raised his hands slowly, palms open. "I ain't here to hurt you." An older girl, maybe 13, pulled a younger boy closer to her. Her eyes were hard. "You one of them? With the torches?" He shook his head. "I'm Thomas Nez. Folks call me Elk Shadow." He didn't add the rest. That he hadn't been called that in years. That he hadn't been anything but a ghost since the fire that took his boy. since they buried Nietzsche while he just stood there, frozen. "They'll kill us," the girl whispered, the words barely audible. Thomas nodded. The truth was all he had to offer them. "Not if we leave now." The boy with the rake, Micah, tightened his grip. "Why should we trust you? You could be one of them, trying to trick us." "You don't have to trust me," Thomas said, his voice low and even. He crouched down to their level, trying to make his large frame seem smaller, less of a threat. "You just have to choose. Them." He nodded toward the angry voices outside. "Or me." A heavy fist slammed against the main barn door, rattling the whole structure. A dog started barking, a frantic, ugly sound. That was it. Time was up. Thomas rose to his full height and turned to a small rear exit, the one leading to the creek. He unlatched it, the sound lost in the noise outside. "Ride with me if you want to live." They moved like ghosts through the overgrown field, the tall grass hiding them from the torchlight. Thomas led the mare, the two smallest children, twin girls who couldn't be more than 7, clinging to the saddle horn. They were so silent, so still, it was like they weren't even breathing. Laya, the older girl, kept looking over her shoulder, her face a pale oval in the dark. "Why are you helping us?" she finally asked, her voice a breathless puff of air. "Nobody helps us." Thomas didn't answer. He just kept moving, his eyes fixed on the dark line of the dry creek bed that would give them cover. This wasn't about helping. This was about a debt to a ghost. Micah, the boy with the rake, ran beside him, his earlier defiance replaced by a tense, watchful energy. "This ain't your fight, old man." "No," Thomas muttered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "But it's one I should have fought a long time ago." An hour later, deep in the winding canyon, he called a halt. He brushed out their tracks with a dead branch, a trick the army had taught him, a trick he'd used to hunt his own people. He led the horse into the shallow water to wash away their scent. The irony wasn't lost on him. He scanned the horizon. Red Hollow was behind them, a bad memory smoldering in the dark. But it wasn't far enough away. He found a shallow rock outcropping, a place to hide without a fire. He gave the kids the last of his jerky, split his water between their 6 cracked mouths. They ate in silence. One of the twins cried softly in her sleep. The others just stared into the darkness, their faces looking old and broken. Thomas sat with his back against the cold stone, every nerve screaming. He didn't close his eyes. He couldn't. "This is a mistake," a voice in his head whispered. But so was doing nothing. So was standing by the grave and letting the silence win. At first light, a thin gray mist hung over the creek. Micah was already awake, perched on a boulder, staring back the way they'd come. "They'll be after us," he said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. The town would wake up. They'd find the barn empty. The fear would turn to rage, and the rage would turn into a hunt. He knew how it worked. He'd been on the other side of it once. Micah's eyes met his. "You going to leave us somewhere safe, or are you sticking around?" Thomas didn't answer. He didn't know. All he knew was the path ahead, winding through the sagebrush like an old scar on the land. He just kept walking. Laya came up beside him, her younger brother Noah holding her hand. The boy hadn't spoken a single word. His eyes were open, but he wasn't really there. He was still back in the smoke. "Where are we going?" Laya asked. Thomas looked at the rough country ahead, a land that didn't forgive mistakes. His answer wasn't meant to be a comfort. It was a promise. "Where no one will find you, until someone finds the truth." But as he said it, he saw something on the trail ahead, a glint of metal in the morning sun. He stopped, motioning for the others to stay back. He walked forward slowly, crouching down. It was a boot spur, not an old, rusted one. This one was new, polished, and the track next to it wasn't from some rancher. It was a military-style boot print, deep, deliberate. They weren't just being followed by a mob. Someone else was out here, someone who knew how to hunt. The sun climbed higher, baking the stones of the creek bed, but the air stayed cold, thin. They walked in the water now, their bare feet numb, their steps silent. The twins were back on the horse, their small bodies slumped together in exhausted sleep. The others walked with a grim determination that didn't belong on the faces of children. Micah finally broke the silence again, his voice low. "That spur back there, that wasn't from some farmer." Thomas kept his eyes forward. "No, it wasn't." "So who else is out here?" "Someone who doesn't want us to reach the sheriff." That shut Micah up. The implication hung in the air, heavier than the heat. It wasn't just a lynch mob anymore. This was something else, something organized. Leah, holding her little brother Noah's hand, looked at Thomas, her eyes wide with a question she didn't dare ask. He just shook his head slightly. "Not now. Keep moving." By midday, they reached the first ridge. Thomas led them up a narrow game trail, a path so faint it was more of a memory than a trail. The sandstone cut into their feet, but no one complained. At the top, he found a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of ancient, twisted juniper. "We rest here," he said, sliding the twins off the horse, "just until the sun is lower." Micah stood guard at the mouth of the cave, his young face set in a hard scowl. He was trying to be a man, and the effort was heartbreaking. Inside the cave, Thomas checked on the smallest twin, Ruthie. She had a cough, a dry, shallow rattle that sent a spike of cold fear through him. He felt her forehead. She was burning up. Leah saw the look on his face. "The smoke," she whispered. "She breathed in too much of the smoke." Thomas nodded grimly. He'd seen it before. It was a slow poison. He sat apart from them, staring out at the vast, empty desert. He had run from this world, from its noise and its pain. He had built walls of silence around his heart, and in one night, 6 children had torn them all down. He wasn't just their guide anymore, he was their only hope. And it felt like a trap. Later, as the brutal afternoon sun began to dip, Micah came and sat near him. "They said you were a tracker for the army," the boy said, not looking at him. "Said you hunted Apache." Thomas didn't deny it. "I did what I thought was right at the time, told myself it was for peace." Micah scoffed, a bitter, adult sound from a child's throat. "How'd your kid die?" The question was a punch to the gut, quick, vicious. Leah started to snap at him, but Thomas held up a hand. He deserved the question. He'd been asking himself the same thing every day for 4 years. "In a fire," Thomas said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. "At the old trading post. They said it was an accident. A lantern tipped over." "You believe them?" Micah pressed, his eyes sharp, relentless. For the first time, Thomas hesitated. "I did. For a long time, I did." Before Micah could ask anything else, Leah spoke from the back of the cave. Her voice was trembling. "He had a gold watch." Thomas turned. "Who did?" "The man," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The one who started the fire at the school. He wore a long black coat. When he ran, something fell. I saw it shine." She reached into a hidden pocket in her tattered dress and pulled it out. It was a gold pocket watch on a heavy chain. It was scratched, but it gleamed in the dim light. She held it out to him. "I picked it up. I didn't tell anyone. I thought maybe it would prove we weren't lying." Thomas took the watch. It was heavy in his palm, still warm from her hand. He turned it over. On the smooth gold back, 3 letters were engraved in elegant script. R.S. Micah leaned in closer, his eyes wide. "Robert Sinclair, the railroad man." Thomas's blood ran cold. Sinclair, he'd been trying to buy up land all over the county, including the parcel the school sat on. The town council had refused to sell. So he burned it, Leah whispered, her face pale. And he was going to let them hang us for it. It made a sick kind of sense, but it felt too easy, too clean. And then Noah, the silent boy, who hadn't made a sound since they fled the barn, let out a small whimper. He tugged on Leah's sleeve, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed a trembling finger not at the watch, but at something else. He was pointing at Thomas's belt, at the worn leather sheath holding his old army knife. Thomas frowned, confused. He pulled the knife out slowly. Noah flinched back, shaking his head frantically. He wasn't afraid of the knife. He was pointing at the handle, at the small, intricate carving Thomas had whittled into the bone years ago. A simple design, the symbol for his family, for the Nez clan. Leah's eyes widened in horror. "Noah," she breathed. "What is it?" Noah finally spoke. His voice was a dry, cracking whisper, a sound that hadn't been used in days. "Same, on his hand." Thomas stared at him. He didn't understand. "The fireman," Noah whispered, tears rolling down his dusty cheeks. "He had that, on his hand. A tattoo. The man who burned the school had a tattoo on his hand. The same symbol carved into Thomas's knife, a symbol known only to a handful of Apache families in the territory. But Robert Sinclair wasn't Apache. This wasn't about a railroad. This was about something else entirely. And whoever was hunting them wasn't just a hired gun. They were family. The air in the cave went thin, sucked out by the impossible revelation. A tattoo. An Apache clan symbol on the hand of a white man in a black coat. It made no sense. It was a piece from a different puzzle, and it turned their entire story upside down. Thomas stared at the carving on his knife, a symbol of his heritage, of his bloodline, a symbol he now knew was on the hand of an arsonist. It felt like a violation, a desecration. "It can't be," Leah whispered, looking from Noah to Thomas. Micah was already thinking, his brow furrowed. "Sinclair doesn't have any tattoos. I've seen him in town. Rolls his sleeves up." "Then it wasn't Sinclair," Thomas said, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots. Or Sinclair wasn't alone. The gold watch with Sinclair's initials, the man with the Apache tattoo, the military boot prints. These weren't random clues. They were pieces of a bigger, uglier picture. Someone was framing Sinclair, or working with him. Someone who wanted them dead for more than just what they saw. He looked at Noah, who was now curled into a tight ball, trembling. The boy had seen something that had literally scared the words out of him. Thomas tucked the watch away and crouched in front of the boy. "Noah, did you see his face?" Noah shook his head, burying his face in Leah's side. "It's okay," Thomas said softly. "You did good. You remembered." But what had he remembered? Who in this territory would have that mark? Thomas knew every family, every clan. Most were scattered, dead, or living on reservations hundreds of miles away. Only a few remained hidden in these hills, and none of them would burn down a school, unless they weren't who they claimed to be. As dusk began to settle, painting the canyon in long, deep shadows, Ruthie's coughing grew worse. Her fever was higher. She was limp in Leah's arms, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "We can't stay here," Leah said, her voice tight with panic. "She needs a doctor, or something." Thomas knew she was right. They were out of water, out of food, and out of time. His plan to disappear into the canyons wasn't going to work. Not with a sick child. He had to make a choice. Go forward into the unknown, deeper into the wilderness, or go back. Back toward the danger, toward the one person who might listen, Sheriff Grady. It was a huge risk. The town was a hornet's nest, and Deputy Kent was watching every road. But Grady was an old-school lawman. He was stubborn and fair. And more importantly, he owed Thomas. Thomas had saved his life during a raid years ago, a debt Grady had never forgotten. "We're moving," Thomas announced, his decision made. "But not deeper in. We're going to circle back, toward the old mission." Micah stared at him. "That's closer to town. They'll find us." "That's the point," Thomas said. "I'm going to make them find us, but on my terms, on my ground." He needed to get a message to Grady, but he couldn't leave the children. He looked at Micah. The boy was smart, reckless, but fast. "I need you to do something," Thomas said, pulling him aside. "It's dangerous." Micah's chin jutted out. "I'm not afraid." "You should be," Thomas said grimly. "That's what'll keep you alive." He explained the plan. Micah would take the fastest, most direct route to the edge of town, find Isabel Santiago, the woman who ran the cantina. She was quiet, but she saw everything, and she hated Deputy Kent. Thomas told Micah a specific phrase to use, a code from the old days. She would know it was from him. She would get word to Grady. While Micah was gone, Thomas would lead the others to a defensible position, a place called the Needle's Eye, a narrow pass in the rocks where 3 men could hold off 100. He was turning the hunt around. He was setting a trap. As they prepared to leave, Laya pulled a folded, dirty piece of paper from her pocket. "Noah drew this," she said. Before he stopped talking, Thomas unfolded it. It was a child's drawing done in charcoal from a burned stick. It was crude, but the image was unmistakable. A tall man in a long coat. One hand was held up, and on the back of it was a shape. The Nez clan symbol. But that wasn't the shocking part. The face. It was just a few simple lines. But the artist had captured one detail with chilling accuracy, a thin white scar that cut through the man's left eyebrow. Thomas froze. His blood turned to ice. He knew that scar. He'd seen it 1,000 times. He'd seen it that very morning, in the reflection from a piece of broken glass as he'd checked their back trail. The man in the drawing, the man with the Apache tattoo who had burned down the school. It was him. It was Thomas Nez. The drawing felt like a snake in his hand, venomous and impossible. His own face, sketched by a terrified child, marked as the monster in the dark. It couldn't be real. It was a nightmare. He looked at the crude lines, the scar over the eye, the clan symbol on the hand, a symbol he didn't have. He had the knife, not the tattoo. It was a lie, a trick. But why? Laya was watching him, her eyes filled with a new, terrible confusion. It looks like you." "It's not me," Thomas said, his voice a rasp. He forced himself to think. The man Noah saw had the tattoo. Thomas didn't. The man Noah saw set the fire. Thomas had watched it burn from the ridge. This was a setup, a frame job so perfect, so insidious, it was designed to not just kill him, but to destroy his very identity. Someone who looked like him, someone who knew his family's symbol. Who? The questions hammered at him, but there was no time. The moon was rising. Micah was waiting for his instructions. Ruthie was fading. "This changes nothing," Thomas said, his voice harder now, colder. He folded the drawing and tucked it safely away. "It just means we're fighting a ghost." He turned to Micah, his eyes burning with a new intensity. "Get to Isabel's. Tell her Elk Shadow calls the debt. Tell her the snake wears a familiar skin. She'll know what it means. And Micah, don't get seen. By anyone." The boy nodded, his face grim. He understood the stakes had just been raised to something terrifying. He slipped out of the cave and disappeared into the twilight like a stone dropped in water. Thomas got the others ready. He lifted Ruthie into his own arms now. She was light as a bundle of dry sticks. Her breath was a faint whisper against his chest. He led them out of the cave and into the growing dark, heading not away from Red Hollow, but towards it, like a moth drawn to a deadly flame. They moved through the night, a small, desperate procession. Every shadow seemed to be watching. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing footstep. Thomas's mind was a storm, a doppelganger, a man with his face, with his heritage, committing atrocities in his name. It was an old Apache tale, a story of skinwalkers, of evil spirits who could steal a man's face. But this wasn't a spirit. This was a man of flesh and blood, and he was trying to erase Thomas from the world. He thought back, scouring his memory. Who knew the symbol? Who knew his history? Who hated him enough to do this? The faces of old enemies swam in his mind, men from the army, rivals from his youth. But one face kept returning, a man he thought was long dead, a cousin, a man cast out from the clan for bloodlust and betrayal during the wars, a man named Cale. They said he'd been killed in a skirmish on the Mexican border. Thomas had never seen the body. Could it be, after all these years? They reached the Needle's Eye just before midnight. It was a formidable place, a narrow slot canyon barely wide enough for a horse to pass through, with high, sheer walls. It was a perfect choke point. He settled the children deep inside a small alcove, hidden from view. He gave Laya his revolver. "You see anyone but me or Micah, you use this," he said, showing her how to aim. "Don't hesitate." Her hand trembled as she took the heavy weapon, but she nodded, her eyes fierce. Thomas took up a position on a high ledge overlooking the entrance to the pass. He was a hunter again, but this time he was hunting himself. He laid his rifle on the rock before him and waited. The desert night grew cold and silent. The silence stretched. An hour passed, then another. He felt the cold seep into his bones, the old ache in his shoulders. Doubt began to creep in. Had he made a mistake? Had he led them into a slaughter? Then he heard it. A single horse moving slowly, cautiously. Not the sound of a posse. The sound of a single rider. A figure appeared in the moonlight at the mouth of the canyon. The rider sat tall in the saddle, a familiar silhouette. It was Sheriff Grady, alone. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Micah had made it. But as Grady dismounted and started to walk into the pass, Thomas saw movement on the ridge opposite him. A flicker of motion, a glint of moonlight on a rifle barrel. It was an ambush. Grady was walking right into a trap meant for him. And then a second figure emerged from the shadows behind the sheriff. He was on foot, moving with a predator's silence. He wore a long, dark coat. Even from this distance, Thomas could see the familiar shape of him, the way he moved. It was like looking in a mirror. The man raised a pistol, aiming it squarely at Sheriff Grady's back. Thomas didn't have time to shout a warning. He had a split second to make a choice. Shoot the man on the ridge with the rifle, or shoot the man who wore his face. He centered his sights on the man behind the sheriff. He squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon like a crack of thunder. The man in the long coat crumpled to the ground. He didn't fall like someone who'd been shot. He dropped, rolling behind a rock with a speed that was unnatural, a professional. Sheriff Grady dove for cover, drawing his own weapon, his face a mask of confusion. "Nez, what in the hell is going on?" Before Thomas could answer, the rifle on the opposite ridge opened up. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near Thomas's head, spraying him with stone chips. He fired back, aiming for the muzzle flash, and was answered by another shot. They were pinned. The man who looked like Thomas was now firing from behind his rock, pinning Grady down. The sniper on the ridge was keeping Thomas from helping him. It was a coordinated attack. They knew he'd be here. They knew he'd protect Grady. This wasn't just a frame-up. This was an execution. "Kent! It's Kent on the ridge!" Grady yelled, his voice echoing in the narrow pass. "I saw him on the way up here. He followed me." Deputy Kent, of course, the military boot prints, the new spur. Kent had been a cavalry scout before he was a lawman. He knew these hills as well as Thomas did. He was in on it. But with who? With the man who wore his face. The fight was a stalemate. Every time Thomas tried to get a clean shot at Kent, the man who looked like him would fire at Grady, forcing Thomas to focus on him instead. And every time Grady moved, Kent would fire down on him. They were caught in a perfect triangle of death. Inside the alcove, the children were terrified. Laya held the revolver with both hands, pointing it toward the mouth of the cave, her knuckles white. Noah was rocking back and forth, his eyes squeezed shut. Ruthie's ragged breathing was the only sound. Laya knew they couldn't stay there. Thomas was trapped. The sheriff was trapped. She had to do something. She looked at the back of the small cave. A thin crack, barely visible in the dark, snaked its way up the rock wall. Maybe, just maybe, it led somewhere. She handed the gun to the boy next to her. "If anyone comes, shoot," she whispered, and started to squeeze her way into the fissure. Outside, the gunfire continued. Thomas knew they were running out of time. Dawn wasn't far off. If Kent and his partner could hold them here until morning, reinforcements from town would arrive, and the story would be simple. The murderer, Thomas Nez, had ambushed the sheriff, and Deputy Kent had heroically tried to stop him. He and Grady would be dead. The children would be captured and silenced. He had to break the stalemate. He took a deep breath, shouted Grady's name, and then in their native Apache he yelled a string of words, a command for a flanking maneuver, an old battle call. It was a bluff. There was no one to flank. But he was betting on one thing, that the man who wore his face also knew his language. And he was right. The man behind the rock hesitated for a fraction of a second, instinctively looking to his left, to the direction of the phantom attack. It was the opening Thomas needed. He fired 2 shots, not at the man, but at the rock just above his head. The bullet struck the stone, sending a shower of sharp fragments down into his position. The man cried out and ducked, momentarily blinded. In that instant, Grady scrambled to better cover, finding a new angle. But the sniper, Kent, knew exactly what had happened. He shifted his aim from Grady to Thomas, knowing Thomas was now exposed. Thomas saw the movement, saw the rifle barrel swing towards him. He knew he wouldn't be fast enough. This is how it ends, he thought, just like Nietzsche, in violence and fire. Suddenly, a small cascade of rocks and pebbles tumbled down from the ridge above Kent. The deputy glanced up, annoyed, thinking it was just a loose slide. That's when Laya appeared. She had climbed through the crack in the cave, up the treacherous backside of the canyon wall. She stood 50 feet above Kent, a small, fierce silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. In her hands, she held a rock the size of her own head. With a desperate scream that was half fear and half rage, she heaved it over the edge. It didn't hit Kent directly. It didn't need to. It struck the ledge right in front of him, shattering with incredible force. The impact threw him off balance. He stumbled backward, his rifle flying from his hands, and with a startled cry, he tumbled off the narrow ledge. His scream was cut short by the sickening crunch of his body hitting the canyon floor below. Silence. The sudden, ringing silence was more shocking than the gunfire. Grady and Thomas both stared, stunned. Then, from behind the rock, the other man emerged. The man with Thomas's face. He saw Kent was gone. He saw Leia on the ridge above. He knew the fight was over. He looked directly at Thomas, a look of pure, cold hatred in his eyes. He raised his hand, and for the first time, Thomas saw it clearly in the growing light. The tattoo. The Nez clan symbol. And under it, another, older tattoo, faded but still visible. A mark Thomas recognized with a jolt of shock. The mark of the U.S. Army Cavalry, 1st Scouts, the same unit Deputy Kent had served in. The man gave Thomas a cold, thin smile. Then he turned and sprinted away, vanishing into the maze of rocks and shadows before Thomas or Grady could get a clear shot. He didn't run like a man escaping. He ran like a man retreating, ready to fight another day. Grady slowly stood up, brushing dust from his clothes. He looked at Kent's body on the canyon floor, then up at Laya, who was now trembling violently, the adrenaline leaving her. Then he looked at Thomas. "You got a lot of explaining to do, Nez," the sheriff said, his voice grim. "Starting with who in the hell that was." Thomas lowered his rifle, his mind reeling from the revelation. An Apache scout from Kent's old unit, a man who looked just like him. It all clicked into place. The frame-up, the military precision. Kent hadn't been working for Sinclair. He was working with this man. But why? What was their goal? He didn't have an answer, but he had Noah's drawing, and he had the watch. He slid down from his ledge and walked over to Grady. He didn't say a word. He just handed the sheriff the drawing of the man with the scar over his eye. Grady stared at it. Then he looked at Thomas's face. He saw the same scar. This is you. No, Thomas said, his voice gravelly. That's the man who just got away, and he's the one who burned down that school. Grady looked from the drawing to Thomas, then back again. The confusion on his face was slowly being replaced by a dawning horror. He finally understood. My God, Grady whispered. What is going on in my town? Before Thomas could answer, a weak voice called out from the alcove. Thomas? It was Leah. She had scrambled back down and was kneeling beside Ruthie. She's not breathing right, Leah cried, her voice breaking. I think we're losing her. Thomas and Grady ran to the alcove. Ruthie was pale, her lips tinged with blue. Each breath was a struggle, a tiny hitching gasp. The smoke inhalation, combined with the cold and the terror, was shutting her small body down. We have to get her to a doctor, Grady said, his lawman's composure returning. Now. The town doctor won't help, Thomas said grimly. He's on the town council. He's one of them. Grady's jaw tightened. Not anymore, he's not. Things are about to change in Red Hollow. He looked at Thomas. But you're right. We can't trust him. There's an old army surgeon, Doc Hemlock, lives about 10 miles east of here. He's a drunk, but he's the best damn doctor in this territory. There was no time to waste. Grady gently lifted Ruthie into his arms. Thomas gathered the other children. They left Kent's body where it lay. Justice for him could wait. Saving a child couldn't. They rode hard, the rising sun at their backs. The children were silent, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Leah rode close to Grady, her eyes never leaving her sister's still form. As they rode, Thomas told Grady everything. The watch, Sinclair, the tattoo. His theory about his cousin, Cale, a man who was supposed to be dead, a man who had served as an army scout, a man who looked enough like Thomas to be his twin. Cale, Grady said, the name tasting like dust. I remember that name. He was part of a special scout unit under Kent's command. They were ruthless. The army disbanded them after a massacre at a settlement near the border. They were supposed to have all been killed in the reprisal. Apparently not all of them, Thomas said. So this isn't about a railroad. This is about revenge. Revenge for what? For being cast out, by the army, by our clan, Thomas guessed. And Kent was his commander. Their loyalty is to each other, not the law. It was a conspiracy born from war and blood, and it was playing out in the heart of Red Hollow. Sinclair was just a pawn, a convenient villain to point the finger at. The real prize was something else, the land, maybe, or simply the pleasure of watching the town, and Thomas, burn. They reached Doc Hemlock's place an hour later. It was a run-down shack surrounded by empty bottles. The doctor himself was a grizzled old man with shaking hands and eyes that had seen too much. But the moment he saw Ruthie, the drunk vanished. The surgeon took over. He worked quickly, his hands suddenly steady. He brewed a pungent herbal concoction to open her lungs and wrapped her in warm blankets. For hours, they waited. The other children fell asleep, huddled together on the floor of the shack. Thomas and Grady stood watch outside. So Cale and Kent, Grady said, piecing it together. They burn the school, knowing the orphans will be blamed. They plant the watch to frame Sinclair, throwing everyone off their trail. And they use Cale's resemblance to you to discredit you if you get involved. It's brilliant, and it's pure evil. What do they want? Thomas asked. That's the part I don't get, Grady admitted. Sinclair wanted the land for the railroad, but if he's just a pawn, what's the real end game? The answer came from an unexpected source, Isabel Santiago. She rode up in the late afternoon, her horse lathered in sweat. She'd heard the gunshots echoing from the canyon and had come looking. Micah was with her, safe. When she saw Thomas and Grady, she didn't waste time with greetings. "It's the silver," she said, her voice urgent. "The old Spanish silver mine, the one that's supposed to be haunted. It's on the school land." Thomas and Grady exchanged a look. The old Culebra mine. It had been sealed for 50 years. Legend said it was empty. "It's not empty," Isabel said. "My grandfather was the last one to work it. He said the Spanish missed a major vein. He wrote it all down in a journal. I still have it. A week ago, Deputy Kent came to me. He offered me money for that journal, a lot of money. I told him I didn't have it." Suddenly, it all made sense. The land wasn't for a railroad. It was for the silver. Kent and Cale were going to use the chaos to get their hands on the deed to the land, hiding their true intentions behind the Sinclair Railroad deal. They'd become rich men, and no one would be the wiser. The fire wasn't just arson. It was a smokescreen for the biggest heist in the territory's history. Just then, Doc Hemlock stepped out of the shack. He looked exhausted, but he managed a small, weary smile. "She's breathing steady," he said. "The fever's broken. The little one's a fighter. She's going to make it." Relief washed over them, so powerful it was dizzying. But it was short-lived. They had won the battle at the Needle's Eye, but the war for Red Hollow was just beginning. Kyle was still out there. He had lost his partner, but he still had his face. Thomas's face. And now he was desperate. A desperate man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous animal in the desert. And he was still hunting them. With Ruthie safe and recovering, the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. It was a twisted plot for land and silver, orchestrated by two disgraced soldiers, Kent and Cale, using Sinclair as a distraction and Thomas's own identity as a weapon. Grady looked at Thomas, his face set like granite. "We're ending this. Today." "How?" Thomas asked. "Cale is a ghost, and half the town thinks I'm a murderer." "We need to get the truth out," Grady said, "but we need more than just our story. We need undeniable proof, and we need to draw Cale out of the shadows." Isabel Santiago spoke up. "The journal. My grandfather's journal. It has maps. It describes the silver vein in detail. If we have that, we have proof of their motive." "Where is it?" Grady asked. "Hidden in the floorboards of the cantina," she said. "But I can't go back. Kyle knows I have it. He'll be watching the place." "He'll be expecting you," Thomas corrected. "He won't be expecting me." A new plan began to form, dangerous and bold. They would use Cale's own strategy against him. They would use the two faces of Thomas Nez to set a final trap. The plan had three parts. First, Micah, who was small and fast, would sneak back into town under the cover of dusk and get a message to Tom Garrett, the rancher who had lost his son in the first fire 4 years ago. The fire that had also killed Thomas's son, Nietzsche. Garrett was a respected man, and his grief had made him bitter, but he was honorable. The message was simple. The fire that took our sons was no accident. The man responsible is still here. Meet at the ruins of the old trading post at midnight. Second, Isabel would ride to the nearby town of Silver Creek and deliver a message to the U.S. Marshal, along with a copy of Noah's drawing and a sworn statement from Sheriff Grady. It would take her hours, but it was their insurance policy. If their plan failed, the truth would still come out. Third, and most dangerous, Thomas and Grady would ride back into Red Hollow together, not to hide, but to make a public appearance. They would walk right into the lion's den. As the sun began to set, casting long blood-red fingers across the desert, Thomas stood with the children. He knelt in front of Laya. "I need you to be strong," he said, his voice low. "Stay here with the doc. Protect the others." Laya's face was solemn. She had grown up 10 years in 2 days. "What if you don't come back?" she whispered. "Then you take this," Thomas said, pressing the worn, bone-handled knife into her hand. "And you run. You take the others and you don't ever look back." He looked at each of them, his heart aching. "You're a family now. Look after each other." He stood up and mounted his horse. Grady was already in the saddle. They rode off without another word, 2 lonely figures against a dying sun. They reached Red Hollow as the last light faded. The town was quiet, but it was the tense, coiled silence of a snake ready to strike. People watched them from shadowy doorways, their faces unreadable. Thomas and Grady dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. A small crowd gathered, drawn by the audacity of their return. "What's going on, Sheriff?" someone called out. Grady held up a hand. "There's been a misunderstanding. Thomas Nez is not the man you should be worried about." From the saloon across the street, Robert Sinclair emerged, flanked by 2 hired guns. He had clearly been released. His face was smug. "That's right, Sheriff. Tell them all how you arrested an innocent man based on the lies of some filthy orphans." "Your innocence is still in question, Sinclair," Grady said, his voice like ice. "But you're not the one who lit the match. You were just the fool who paid for it." Sinclair's smirk vanished. At that moment, Thomas saw him, standing at the edge of the crowd, half hidden in the shadows of the blacksmith's shop. Cale. He was wearing simple rancher's clothes, but there was no mistaking the cold hatred in his eyes. He was watching, waiting to see how his plan would unfold. This was it, the final act. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes locked on Cale. He spoke loud enough for the whole town to hear. "The man who burned your school, the man who tried to kill your sheriff, is a soldier who dishonored his uniform and a man who dishonored his blood. He hides behind my face, but he is nothing more than a coward and a thief." Cale didn't move, but a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He hadn't expected this, a direct, public confrontation. "He is here," Thomas continued, his voice ringing through the silent square. "Among us now. He thinks you are sheep. He thinks you will follow the lies." Then Grady played his part. "The land he's after isn't for a railroad. It's for the Spanish silver he thinks is buried beneath it. He used you, Sinclair. He used all of you." He pulled out the gold watch and tossed it to Sinclair. "Is this yours?" Then he pulled out Noah's drawing. "Or does this look more familiar?" The crowd murmured, confused, pressing in to see the drawing. They saw the face. They saw Thomas. Cale saw his opening. This was the moment he'd planned for. The town, confused and angry, seeing proof that Thomas was the villain. He stepped out of the shadows, a pistol in his hand. "He's the one!" Cale shouted, his voice a perfect imitation of Thomas's. "The killer! He's confessing!" The crowd gasped. 2 men, identical, one accusing the other. It was chaos. But Thomas was ready. He didn't look at Cale. He looked at the townspeople. "You want to know the difference between us?" Thomas said calmly. "I'm the one who stayed when my son died. I'm the one who buried my heart in this town. He's the one who ran." He then held up his empty right hand. "And I'm the one who doesn't have a tattoo." Kyle froze. It was a detail he'd overlooked. In his arrogance, he assumed no one would ever get close enough to see both of them at the same time. He instinctively tried to hide his hand. It was the only confession the town needed. But Cale wasn't going to be taken alive. He raised his pistol, not at Thomas, but at Sinclair. If he was going down, he was taking the whole conspiracy with him. Before he could fire, another shot rang out. Not from Grady, not from Thomas. The shot came from the rooftop of the general store. Cale staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the ground. Everyone looked up. Standing on the roof, rifle in hand, was Tom Garrett. His face was a grim mask of a father's justice. Micah had delivered the message. It was over. Grady's men moved in and apprehended Cale. Sinclair and his hired guns surrendered without a fight. The crowd stood in stunned silence, the web of lies finally, brutally untangled. As they slapped the irons on Kyle, he looked at Thomas, his face twisted in a bloody sneer. "You should have died in that fire with your boy," he spat. "Maybe I did," Thomas said quietly. "But tonight, I came back." He turned away from the wreckage of the past and looked down the long, dark road leading out of town, the road back to his children, his family, his home. The winter came late that year, blanketing the ridges in a soft, forgiving layer of white. The air over Red Hollow was clean for the first time in a long time. The smoke had cleared, both from the schoolhouse and from the hearts of the townspeople. The truth, once it came out, had been a bitter pill, but it was a necessary medicine. Cale and Sinclair were gone, taken by the U.S. Marshals to face federal charges. The town council had been dissolved, and Sheriff Grady, with Tom Garrett at his side, was helping the people of Red Hollow rebuild, not just their school, but their trust. Up on the ridge, at the old, forgotten Nez homestead, smoke curled from the chimney in a steady, peaceful column. The broken fences had been mended, the dry well had been cleared. And the house, which had stood silent for 4 long years, was filled with the sounds of life. Inside, the long table was crowded. Leah, her face bright with a confidence Thomas had never seen, served bowls of hot rabbit stew. Micah, who now stood nearly as tall as Thomas, brought in a fresh load of firewood, shaking the snow from his shoulders. The twins, Rose and a now healthy Ruthie, chased each other around the hearth, their laughter echoing off the newly patched walls. And Noah, the boy who had been stolen by silence, sat at the end of the table, quietly carving a small wooden horse, a perfect replica of S. Thomas Nez sat at the head of the table, in a chair that had been empty for too long. He watched them, this impossible, broken, and beautiful family he had found in the ashes. They were not bound by blood, but by fire, by fear, and by the shared journey through the darkness. They were stronger than blood. They were survivors. Later that night, when the fire was burning low and the children were wrapped in blankets, a tradition born of their first nights in the wild, Thomas finally told them the one part of the story he had left out. "The first fire," he said, his voice low, the words he had never spoken aloud before. "The one that took my son. It wasn't an accident." The children went still, their eyes fixed on him. Kyle admitted it to Grady before they took him away. He and Kent were partners even back then. They thought the old trading post was sitting on a gold deposit. They set the fire to scare the owner off the land. They didn't know my Nietzsche was sleeping in the back room. He paused, the old pain a familiar ghost. They let everyone believe it was an accident, and I believed them. I let the guilt eat me alive for 4 years. I thought my carelessness was what killed him. Leah reached out and put her small hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it anchored him. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. "No," Thomas said, a great crushing weight finally lifting from his soul. "It wasn't." He looked at the faces around him, illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. "He didn't just take my son. He took my voice. He took my trust. He left me in a prison of silence." He looked at Noah, who was watching him with wide, understanding eyes. "You all gave it back to me. You saved me from the quiet." Micah, who rarely showed emotion, cleared his throat. "You saved us first." Thomas shook his head. "No. We saved each other." The fire crackled, the wind howled softly outside the little house, but inside it was warm. It was safe. It was home. In the morning, Thomas stood on the porch, a mug of hot coffee in his hands. The world was white and new. He looked out at the valley, at the small stone marker under the big pine tree where Nietzsche was buried. For the first time, he didn't feel the sharp sting of loss when he looked at it. He felt a quiet peace. He walked out, the snow crunching under his boots, and stood before the grave. He told his son everything. He told him about Micah and Leah, about the twins and Noah. He told him that their home was full again, that he wasn't alone anymore. "They're good kids, Nietzsche," he whispered, his breath pluming in the cold air. "They're stubborn and brave. They remind me of you." He stood there for a long time, the silence no longer an enemy, but a friend. When he turned back to the house, he saw them all standing on the porch watching him, his family, waiting for him to come home. And as he walked toward them, toward the light and the laughter, he knew the truth of his journey. The thing you think you're saving sometimes is the very thing that ends up saving you. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, and you want to hear more tales where the strange, dark, and mysterious come to light, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments below, what do you think was the single bravest act in this entire story? I'll be reading your answers. Thanks for watching.